What turned the most boring city in Canada into an international headline? Of course, I'm talking about the Canadian Freedom Convoy protests. As of the making of this video, the protests have stopped and luckily nobody was killed. Now, normally any peaceful and non-destructive protest should be tolerated by everybody. You might not agree with the ideology of the protesters, but you should respect their right to protest. We've all heard this talking point many times, and I don't think this is a problem for most people. But with the recent trucker protest, things are not this simple. These recent protests were so controversial because they were disruptive. Disruptive protests don't get the same green light as non-disruptive ones, because they can conflict with the rights and freedoms of other people not involved in the protest. For example, they can interfere with someone's ability to go to work and buy food. And no reasonable person can deny the trucker protests were disruptive. Not only this, but they were disruptive on a scale that is unprecedented in recent Canadian history. In Ottawa alone, they blocked traffic for 3 weeks, disrupted the peace of nearby residents, put hundreds of people out of work, and racked up millions of dollars in police resources. There were also many spin-off protests around the country, such as the week-long closing of the Coutts border crossing in Alberta, or the blocking of the Ambassador Bridge, which is said to transfer $350 million a day in trade between Canada and the United States. This is not to suggest that disruptive protests are never justified, but before you, quote, dismantle the system or shut down part of the economy, you should first ask the question, is the disruption proportional to the value of the cause you are fighting for? Of course, in this case, the protesters would probably respond by saying that they were fighting for freedom, and this freedom is so fundamental that the disruptions were justified. It is certainly true that we should place a great value on individual freedom, but there is a problem with the framing of the issue as freedom versus no freedom. The protesters were not defending the freedom of the people in a general sense, as though everyone's freedom was at risk. The protesters were only advocating for freedom of a small minority in one very specific instance. Parallel examples could be to protest against the legal requirement to wear a seatbelt in your car, or if you protested the fluorination of drinking water. Freedom has never been unconditioned to begin with. The protesters were not fighting for freedom in its entirety because that has never existed in the first place. They were just arguing about a specific law, and this is something people do all the time without the need for disruptive protests. It's also worth highlighting that the protesters themselves limited for weeks the freedoms of anyone who lived or worked in the downtown core. So the freedom defense eventually leads us to an argument about whose freedom is more important. Okay, let's move away from the freedom argument and focus on the merits of the controversial law, vaccine mandates and passports. Now, in defense of the truckers, it was an unusual policy to mandate all of them to be vaccinated, especially at a time when many COVID restrictions are coming to an end around the world, and considering that 90% of the truckers are already vaccinated. The government cannot reasonably expect the ideal situation where everyone gets a vaccine, and this is not even required for herd immunity. In addition, the government's use of the Emergency Act has received much criticism for being unnecessary and excessive, since we can point to many instances where local laws and well-coordinated resources were sufficient to end disruptive protests. An example is the end to the blockade in Coutts, Alberta. Now, as I say this, it's also fair to point out that it's easy to criticize COVID regulations in hindsight. People in power who make decisions rarely get commended for things they prevented from happening, because there is really no way to know how bad things could have been, so we're only left to judge the inconveniences of the decisions they did make. In other words, it's easy to complain and ask, why did you not do things this way? In order to be consistent on the issues over the past few weeks, we should make a clear distinction between the behavior of the protesters and their ideology. Unfortunately, many commentators in the media just lumped everything together as being all good or all bad. On the left, we saw a lot of time spent misrepresenting the protesters' ideology. It's not reasonable to deflect requests to address the protesters by labeling all of them with overused slurs like misogynist, racist, and homophobe. It's a lazy and cowardly attempt to pivot away from the issues. I understand you can point to a few instances of this behavior, but it does not mean that it is a unifying value among all the protesters. What is more important is to comment on the ideas that are common to all of the protesters, and this was not done. On the right, we saw a major downplaying of the protesters' behavior. Especially considering the scale of the disruptions, commentary from the right has been overly supportive of the protests, and some, especially commentary on American media, were hypercritical of efforts by the police to end the protests.
Well, quite frankly, I think Trudeau just declared his country to be a dictatorship, not a democracy.
These talking points feel out of place when contrasted with the appeal to law and order we saw with other disruptive protests by, say, Black Lives Matter or the 2020 Indigenous protests of railways and pipelines. At the end of the day, it is reasonable to support the cause of the protest, but not the way it was executed. The most significant consequence of this protest will be the way it shifts the norms of future protests. And we'll have to wait and see how it affects the way people vent their political frustrations in Canada and the US going forward.